Open Secrets has launched a new investigative series titled Who Owns South Africa? The series offers in-depth analysis of the powerful private interests that dominate large parts of the South African economy. By examining both the broader system and key sectors, WOSA aims to reveal who truly controls the private sector. The first profile in the series, The System, Money, Power and Politics, unpacks the foundations of South Africa's political economy, exposing the forces that shape power and control in the country. Joining me now is Michael Marchant, Head of Investigations at Open Secrets. Michael, a very good morning to you and thank you so much for joining us. Maybe let's start off by talking about your research methodology and just some of the data analysis, and perhaps talk to us about the intention and really what prompted this investigation, and how do you ensure the data accuracy and the credibility for such a report?
Morning, Katlego. Thank you very much for having me on the show this morning. So I think if I can, I'll start with the second question, which is why we did it, and then I'll turn to the first question, which is, how we've done it and the data that we rely on. So, why we've done it, there are a couple of reasons, but I think kind of first and foremost is that we want to enter the debate in South Africa around explanations for why we are stuck and why we remain such an unequal society. And I think from our perspective that we think that there are a couple of problems with the current debate. The first is that for many people, there is a very narrow focus on the state and state power. And we would definitely agree that corruption within the states is a massive problem, and that weaknesses within the states and the kind of erosion of state capacity that we see in South Africa is a massive problem. And it's a big part of the explanation for why things go wrong. But we don't think it's adequate. And on the other side, of course, there's the other side of the debate, which tends to talk about the private sector, even when it's critical of it, in very broad terms. There's lots of people in South Africa, for example, who talk about monopoly capital or white monopoly capital. And so really the purpose of the Who Owns South Africa series is to say corporate power is clearly incredibly important in explaining some of today's problems in South Africa. But that demands that we really answer the question, who is that corporate power? Who are the corporations that dominate different sectors? And then, of course, who are the individuals and the companies behind them? Who owns them? And so this, I guess, takes us to your first question, Katlego, which is the methodology. And really what we're doing here is we're relying on information that's in the public domain in different places, and we're bringing it together into, a single series. And of course, because especially for South Africa, most of South Africa's largest companies would be public companies and listed on the stock exchange, they're required to publish this information. And so a lot of the time we're spending is piecing together information that's in the public domain, for example, through company reports, and other places, as well as academic and other analysis. And we're trying to kind of bring that all together into something that we hope tells a story about some of the issues facing South Africa and why.
I mean, speaking of that, like you mentioned, this first profile really does explore that deep structural divide between the fragile bottom and the powerful corporate top. What for you were the most surprising or counterintuitive findings in this report regarding the concentration of wealth and political influence?
So, I mean, it's a great question, Katlego. I think in terms of what wasn't surprising is that the levels of inequality are so high. And I think we would also argue what wasn't surprising is that so much of the wealth and concentration of power remains within the hands that it was in at the end of the apartheid regime. And so what we write about a lot, within the chapter is how the economic system that existed at the end of the apartheid system has changed in some ways, but they're really relatively minor. And the majority of the efforts that the state has made to bring in a few new individuals to that economic system and the people who benefit, but not really to shift the system at all. I think in terms of the maybe more surprising findings, or the findings that, even if not surprising, are perhaps the most important, is that we write quite a lot about the rise of the financial sector in South Africa. South Africa's economy over hundreds of years, was built really on the mining sector and what people often refer to as the mineral energy complex. And those companies retain a lot of power. Sasol, the big mining houses, and others, they're still very important for our economy. But they arguably do not exert the same influence and power that the banks do today, for example. And this is not, unique or limited to South Africa, but South Africa, like many places, has seen a kind of financialization of its economy over time, which means really that banks, asset managers, and others have become more and more powerful, and that even non-financial companies increasingly are pivoting towards financial products, either to actually, provide financial products or to invest their returns in financial markets rather than reinvesting. And I mean, just Katlego, to really stress this, the reason we think that this is so important is that it really goes to the heart of why South Africa's economy can stutter along at the moment. It doesn't create jobs. Unemployment is incredibly high. Wages are not going up. People are really struggling. And yet, the JSE can be at an all-time high. And the people at the top of the system are benefiting immensely. And we think the fact that economic system that is so bifurcated and only works for a few, you need to understand the kind of growing power of finance in South Africa's economy in order to understand that.
And I mean, in the report, you really do demonstrate that tale of two cities being South Africa, that deep divide between, like you say, such a sophisticated banking system, and yet you've got so much unemployment and poverty that still exists within these communities. How do you address potential issues of opacity and secrecy in revealing the true ownership and just that influence behind many of these economic entities?
So I think it's, I mentioned at the beginning that we rely on a lot of publicly accessible information. And so I think it's really the answer to that question is twofold. That for publicly listed companies, for the most part, we have a fair degree of transparency. We're able to understand exactly who owns what proportions of them for the most part, and that information is publicly available. What I would say that is still a massive challenge in South Africa is that when we turn to private companies, non-listed companies, for example, and also still the way particularly wealthy individuals and corporations sometimes use trusts and other corporate vehicles like that, that's the point at which there is still a massive issue around transparency. Now, we talk a little bit in the report about the problems around beneficial ownership in South Africa. It's a long-running issue about how, secrecy within companies has been used for a range of issues to hide beneficial ownership, which can be used to hide wealth, but it can also, of course, hide individuals that are involved in corruption. South Africa now does have a beneficial ownership registry for private non-listed companies, but that is not accessible to people like you and me. It is only accessible to law enforcement. And as we know in South Africa, law enforcement agencies, are obviously inconsistent, but are really struggling for resources. And so I think moving that beneficial ownership registry to ensure that even more corporate entities and trusts, for example, are open to public scrutiny from journalists and civil society, that would be an important step in addressing, at least some of these issues.
I mean, in the report, you also touch on some concepts such as sacrifice zones, and this would be communities and hotspots that exist where chemical pollution takes place, especially where people are immediately adjacent to heavy polluting industries. But I suppose the juxtaposition is that these industries are also offering jobs to those same communities, and it's that economic give and take that one needs to look at in terms of their health as well. How in the report do ownership patterns identified correlate with ongoing issues of inequality and social exclusion in our country?
So, Katlego, I think that this really goes to the heart of the issues facing South Africa's economy. And as you've said, the idea behind sacrifice zones are these are poor communities, almost always black and brown communities in South Africa, that have been built historically as buffer zones for white communities and built adjacent to some of the most polluting industries in South Africa. We're thinking here about companies like Sasol, mines, petroleum refineries in South Durban are good examples of this, where communities nearby, yes, they may rely on them for a narrow set of jobs, but they really are left with little choice. Now, I guess the question then is that if that was the case, if that system was built up out of apartheid, why 30 years into democracy have we not seen a greater shift? And I think it returns to the point that I raised earlier, is that what we've ended up doing is we've ended up building a very sophisticated and well-functioning financial system in some of the economic hubs, but it doesn't employ a great number of people. And what we haven't seen in South Africa is any systemic kind of successful effort to grow jobs in other parts of the economy and grow opportunities for people to get reasonably paying jobs. And we also haven't seen any effort to really, or insufficient effort to regulate and control those polluting industries. In terms of how that I guess overlaps with some of the ownership questions we've been talking about, the one is really concentration of ownership, that there remains a very small group of players, for example, in those polluting industries that are calling the shots. And they often threaten the state, essentially, as you've said, Katlego, to say, yes, people might be dying in the communities near to us, but we might be the only source of jobs in this community. So you're really left with very little choice. And of course, the other side of the equation here is the ownership of the economy, in the sense that great deals of our economy are now owned by banks and asset managers who are making investment decisions. And those investment decisions really are, channeling the direction of the country. And I think, in the following kind of profiles that we're doing for Who Owns South Africa, this was just the first. One of the things we really want to dig in is in more detail to those asset managers, those banks, and the decisions that they're making and the consequences it has for inequality and some of the issues that you've just raised.
So with your findings so far, Michael, how much power then has the ANC truly had over the years, in the last 30 years, with regards to the ownership of our economy and just the power play between themselves and the supposed owners of South Africa?
Katlego, I would say that this is one of the most difficult questions to answer, because there are two elements to the story here. The one is that, as I've said, the ANC as a governing party clearly has done not enough to challenge the underlying structures of South Africa's economy. But the kind of question as to whether that was because it was constrained by various factors, to what extent it was that, and to what extent it has decided to follow this path, that's quite difficult to answer. There's no doubt that when it came to power in the mid-90s, it faced a global system where there were enormous pressures to liberalize our economy, to allow corporations impunity, to allow corporations to send their money offshore. And that's had a huge impact, for example, on our economy. And we also know that it faced a huge amount of challenge to get finance, for example, to fulfill its democratic priorities. And yet at the same time, I think we must acknowledge as well that as a governing party over 30 years, the ANC has had state power and it hasn't leveraged it sufficiently. Instead, what it's done is it's looked at the situation and it has tended, in most instances, not all, to favor capital. And that's really had very serious consequences.
I need to let you go, Michael, but very quickly, what is the most urgent action now needed to dismantle the nexus of money, power and inequality that has now been revealed in this report?
I think that the most important thing is to really fundamentally rethink how we challenge concentration of private ownership in our economy. We are living in a state in South Africa where there's very low levels of trust in the state. And so that tends to move us towards a feeling of like, well, maybe the private sector can take care of things. I think what our profile shows is that those small group of private actors that are currently benefiting from the system, their interests often do not align with the majority of South Africans. And so what we need to do is we need to rebuild a capable state that is capable of regulating that power, challenging that power, and ensuring that an economy that can be built, essentially, that can benefit more than an incredibly narrow group of actors.
And essentially, are they the owners of South Africa?
They are the very small group of people that own the largest corporations in South Africa. For the most part, I would say they are the owners.
All right, that was Michael Marchant. Thank you so much for your time. The head of investigations at Open Secrets with their first series of Who Owns South Africa.